It was the dawn of a decisive day. The sky was still gray when Captain James Whitmore received the order that would change everything. His voice trembled slightly over the phone, not from fear, but from the enormity of what he was about to hear. On the other end of the line, the command was clear and impossible at the same time. Transform 5 miles of impassable swamp into a road capable of supporting 60 tons of tanks. The deadline? 96 hours, 4 days. As he hung up the phone, Whitmore looked out the window of his tent and saw the terrain that awaited him. Mud as far as the eye could see, stagnant water, dense vegetation, and a heavy silence that seemed to mock the newly entrusted mission. Whitmore was no ordinary man. A civil engineering graduate from West Point Military Academy, he had seen it all in his 15 years of service. He had built bridges under enemy fire in Europe, blasted mountains to clear passage through rocky terrain, and coordinated rescue operations in conditions that would have made anyone give up. But this was different. This swamp wasn't just a geographical obstacle. It was a living monster, swallowing machines, devouring hope, and turning determined men into defeated figures. And he had only 96 hours to tame it. The news spread quickly through the camp. Men covered in grease and exhausted from previous missions stopped what they were doing when they heard the announcement. Some laughed, thinking it was a cruel joke. Others shook their heads in disbelief. But when they saw Whitmore emerging from his tent with maps under his arm, and that determined expression they knew well, they understood it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. And in the Army, orders weren't discussed. They were followed. The first hour was devoted to reconnaissance. Whitmore assembled his elite team of engineers, men trained for the impossible. Together they walked through the swamp, feeling the mud suck their boots with every step, measuring depths, testing the soil's strength, noting every detail. Sergeant McCoy, a 6'7" Texan with hands the size of shovels, was the first to speak their minds. "Captain," he said respectfully, "this isn't dirt. It's soup. How are we going to make a road through soup?" Whitmore didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, scooped up a handful of mud, and let it run through his fingers. Then he looked at McCoy and the other men around him. "We're going to do it because we have no choice," he said simply. "And because if we don't, good men will die trying to cross this on foot." Before we get into how to subscribe to the channel and comment on the time you're watching, let me tell you how this impossible story unfolded. The first 12 hours were spent in intense planning. Whitmore and his team worked tirelessly, drawing maps, calculating volumes, and estimating resources. They would need stone, tons and tons of stone, to create a solid foundation. They would need timber, large logs that could be used as stabilizers. They would need sand, compacted earth, and above all, heavy machinery that wouldn't sink before doing its job. The math was brutal. For every meter of road, they estimated they would need approximately 30 tons of material. Multiplied by 8,000 meters, they were talking about 240,000 tons of resources that needed to be transported. Organized and applied in less than 100 hours, logistics were a nightmare. The nearest quarry was 30 kilometers away. Suitable trees for lumber were scattered throughout a dense forest to the east. And the heavy equipment, the excavators and bulldozers that wouldn't sink in the mud, was being used on another front 2 days away. Whitmore picked up the radio and started making calls. He called in favors, negotiated deadlines, and when diplomacy failed, used the authority of his rank to requisition what he needed. Within 6 hours, he had secured 50 trucks, 12 modified bulldozers with extra-wide tracks, 6 excavators, and an army of 200 extra men who would be diverted from other missions as resources began to arrive. Whitmore divided his operation into 3 simultaneous fronts. Alpha Team would be responsible for extracting and transporting stone from the quarry. Bravo Team would handle timber harvesting and preparation. And Charlie Team, led by himself, would begin work preparing the swamp, creating drainage channels, and testing stabilization techniques. It was a complex orchestration where each move hinged on the success of the previous one, and where any delay on one front would jeopardize the entire operation. Alpha Team departed before dawn on the second day. Led by Lieutenant Rodriguez, a mining engineer with demolition experience, they arrived at the quarry and immediately began work. The process was more complicated than simply loading rocks onto trucks. They needed specific sizes, fragments large enough to create structure, but small enough to fit together and form a cohesive base. Rodriguez organized his team into continuous shifts. Some men operated the crushers, breaking large rock formations into manageable chunks. Others loaded the trucks on a never-stop production line. And a third group maintained the equipment, because a broken machine meant delay, and delay meant failure. Trucks began arriving at the swamp in convoys of 5 vehicles, one after the other, kicking up clouds of dust on the dry roads and then struggling through the mud as they approached the worksite. Each truck carried about 15 tons of rock, and they arrived every 40 minutes. Unloading had to be quick and precise. Drivers learned to position their vehicles at just the right angle, lift the bucket, and drop the load in spots previously marked by Whitmore and his team. It was a mechanical ballet performed by exhausted men working 18-hour shifts. Meanwhile, Bravo Team faced its own challenges in the forest. Sergeant Chen, a forester who had served in the Pacific Northwest before enlisting, led the felling operation. They couldn't simply cut down any tree. They needed specific species with the density and strength to withstand extreme weight when submerged in mud. Chen identified a stand of mature oaks about 15 kilometers from the swamp. Using chainsaws and steel cables, his team began the meticulous work of felling, thinning, and transporting logs that weighed more than half a ton each. Transporting the timber presented an unexpected problem. The logs were too heavy for conventional trucks and too long to maneuver easily through the narrow forest trails. Chen improvised, creating a system of tractor-pulled sleds that slid the logs over the damp forest floor until they reached the main roads, where they could be loaded onto special flatbed trucks. It was a slow and dangerous process. 2 men were injured when a cable snapped and a log rolled downhill. But Chen kept his team focused, constantly reminding them that the soldiers were counting on them. Back at the swamp, Whitmore faced the most immediate challenge: where exactly to build the road. The terrain wasn't uniformly bad. There were sections where the soil held some consistency, areas where the water was shallower, and spots where natural rock outcrops offered better footing. Using long sticks marked with measurements, his team meticulously mapped every square meter of the planned route, creating a detailed profile of the mud depth and soil composition. This survey revealed an uncomfortable truth. In some spots, the mud was over 10 feet deep, a viscous abyss that would swallow anything that tried to cross it. Whitmore made a bold decision. Instead of attempting to drain the entire swamp, which would be impossible in the time available, they would create a floating structure, a sort of giant causeway that would distribute the weight of the tanks over a larger area. The concept was simple in theory, but brutally difficult in execution. First, they would lay a base of large logs, laid perpendicular to the direction of the road, creating a sort of wooden raft. On top of this log base, they would pour a thick layer of smaller stones, which would fit into the spaces between the logs and create a more stable surface. Finally, over the stones, they would apply a mixture of gravel and compacted earth, forming the final surface on which the tanks would roll. Work began on the morning of the second day, with only 72 hours remaining. The first logs were positioned in the shallowest section of the swamp, where the mud was only 2 feet deep. Even there, the work was grueling. The men waded knee-deep, some waist-deep in mud, pushing and pulling the heavy logs with ropes and hooks. Their clothes were soaked with dirty water. Their muscles screamed with exertion, but they did not stop. Whitmore worked alongside his men, refusing any privileges of rank, as covered in mud as the youngest soldier. As the log foundation extended deeper into the swamp, a critical problem emerged. In the deepest sections, the logs simply sank, disappearing into the mud as if they had never been there. Whitmore gathered his team for an emergency troubleshooting session. A young corporal named Jensen, who had studied structural engineering for 2 semesters before enlisting, suggested a radical idea. What if they created a vertical support structure first, driving piles deep into the mud until they reached solid ground, and then supported the horizontal logs on top of those piles? It was brilliant, but it would require even more lumber and time, two resources that were in dangerously short supply. Whitmore made the decision in seconds. They would try Jensen's technique on the most problematic sections. This meant splitting the team even further, diverting men to pile driving, while others continued with the original approach where the ground was less treacherous. The operation now had 4 simultaneous fronts, each dependent on the others, each operating at the absolute limit of human capacity. The night of the second day brought rain, not a gentle drizzle, but a violent storm that turned the swamp into a veritable watery hell. Visibility dropped to near zero. The portable searchlights that had been installed to allow night work barely penetrated the curtain of water. Many commanders would have ordered a pause in operations, waiting for the storm to pass. But Whitmore knew they didn't have that luxury. Every hour lost was an hour they wouldn't get back. So they pressed on, working in the dark and the mud under torrential rain, guided only by waterproof flashlights and sheer determination. It was during this storm that they nearly lost everything. One of the tractors, a key machine for positioning the heaviest logs, began to sink in a seemingly stable section. The operator, a specialist named Kowalski, felt the machine tilt dangerously and shouted for help. Within minutes, a dozen men were in the water, tying steel cables to the tractor, desperately trying to keep it from sinking completely. They pulled and pulled, their feet slipping in the mud, their backs nearly breaking with the effort. Slowly, painfully, inch by inch, the tractor was dragged back to firmer ground. When it was finally safe, the men simply collapsed to the ground, too exhausted even to celebrate. Dawn on the third day revealed the progress they had made. Approximately 2 miles of road were now in various stages of completion. The log base was complete in some sections, covered with stone in others, and about half a mile was completely finished. It was progress, but it wasn't enough. 48 hours remaining. 5 kilometers still to build. The math was cruel and clear. They needed to double their work speed. Whitmore gathered all the team leaders together. His voice was hoarse from barking orders for 48 hours straight, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his determination was unwavering. "Gentlemen," he said, "I know you're exhausted. I know this seems impossible, but I want you to think of the men who depend on us. I want you to think of the families these men have back home. If we fail, they will try to cross this swamp another way, and many will not return. We cannot let that happen. We will not let that happen. Now get back to work and make the impossible happen." The response was immediate. The men, despite their exhaustion, found reserves of energy they hadn't known they had. Work crews spontaneously reorganized, creating more efficient systems. Truck drivers reduced their turnaround times, driving faster, unloading faster, and returning for more loads faster. The logging crew in the forest increased its production, working continuous shifts without a break. And in the swamp itself, the engineers developed a synchronized dance, where each man knew exactly where to be, what to do, and how his work fit into the greater whole. Around noon on the third day, they received unexpected visitors. A group of high-ranking officials had arrived to assess progress and, as rumors suggested, possibly call off the operation if it seemed impossible to complete. Whitmore greeted them, covered from head to toe in mud, unapologetic about his appearance. He took them on a tour of the construction site, explaining each step of the process, pointing out the challenges they had overcome, and being brutally honest about the difficulties they still faced. The officers watched in silence, their expressions shifting from skepticism to surprise and finally to cautious respect. As he departed, Colonel Harrison, an engineer veteran of 3 wars, took Whitmore aside. "Captain," he said, "what you're doing here is remarkable. But be realistic with me. Do you really think you can finish on time?" Whitmore looked the colonel directly in the eye. "Sir," he replied, "I don't think so, I know. Because failure is not an option I'm willing to consider." The afternoon of the third day brought another complication. One of the trucks transporting rock overturned on a curve, spilling 15 tons of material onto the road and completely blocking the supply route. For 2 precious hours, no new material arrived at the swamp as crews worked frantically to clear the road and recover the load. During this time, the crews in the swamp continued to work with the material they had, but the pace slowed noticeably. Whitmore used this forced slowdown to adjust his strategy, identifying sections where he could use less material without compromising structural integrity. When the trucks finally started flowing again, the operation resumed with renewed intensity. The men knew they had lost valuable time and worked even harder to make up for it. It was like watching a perfectly calibrated machine, each component working in absolute harmony with the others. Trucks arrived and departed at a steady pace. Logs were positioned with military precision. Rocks were dumped and scattered by teams moving as if rehearsed. And slowly, inexorably, the road grew. The night of the third day was when the true test of endurance began. With only 24 hours remaining and still over 2 kilometers to cover, it was clear there would be no sleep for anyone. Whitmore established a system of micro-breaks where the men could rest for 15 minutes every 2 hours, but never all at the same time. There always had to be movement, always had to be progress. Some men fell asleep standing up, leaning on shovels or iron bars. Others developed an almost meditative state, their bodies performing tasks automatically, while their minds wandered somewhere between consciousness and sleep. It was during this endless night that something extraordinary happened. Word of the operation had spread to neighboring camps, and soldiers from other units began showing up, offering assistance. They hadn't been ordered to come. They wouldn't receive official credit or recognition. They simply heard about the impossible mission and wanted to be a part of it. Whitmore accepted them without hesitation, quickly integrating them into the work crews. With this expanded workforce, the construction pace increased significantly. Dawn on the fourth day brought a sight that seemed miraculous. More than 7 kilometers of road were now substantially complete. The first sections, laid 3 days earlier, had settled and stabilized, forming a surprisingly solid surface. Whitmore ordered a preliminary test. One of the smaller tractors, weighing about 10 tons, was driven slowly over the road. Everyone held their breath as the machine advanced. The road held. Not perfectly. There were some sections where the tractor track sank a few inches, but it held. It was encouraging, but not conclusive. The tanks that would need to use this road weighed 6 times as much. With 18 hours remaining, Whitmore made a final strategic decision. Rather than attempting to complete all 8 kilometers perfectly, they would focus on creating a usable surface along the entire length, then return to reinforce the weaker sections. It was risky, meaning some parts of the road would be only marginally suitable, but it was the only way to complete the mission on time. The last few hours were a frantic race against the clock. Every minute counted, every movement had to be purposeful. The final stretch of road, a 200-meter stretch through the deepest part of the swamp, was particularly challenging. Here, the mud was nearly 4 meters deep, and Jensen's vertical pile technique was taken to the extreme. They drove piles 6 meters deep, creating a veritable forest of underwater supports before placing the horizontal logs on top. With 6 hours remaining, the basic 5-mile structure was complete. But many sections still lacked the final layer of gravel and compacted earth. Whitmore divided his crews one last time. Half would continue applying the finish coat to the road, working from one end to the other. The other half would begin reinforcing the sections identified as weaker, adding extra material where needed. It was a delicate operation, requiring precise judgment about where each ton of material would be most effective. 3 hours before the deadline, a scene unfolded that no one would ever forget. Whitmore was coordinating the reinforcement of a particularly problematic section when he heard a scream from the crew working on the finishing touches. He ran over and saw something that made his heart race. The last gravel truck had arrived, and its load was being dumped onto the final unfinished section of the road. As the material fell, men immediately spread it with shovels and rakes, working so fast their hands were a blur of motion. When the last shovel of gravel was spread, an eerie silence fell over the group. They had done it. The road was physically complete from end to end, but complete didn't mean tested. With 2 hours remaining on the deadline, Whitmore ordered the final test. 3 complete main battle tanks, each weighing exactly 60 tons, were brought to the roadhead. The tank commanders had been briefed on what was about to happen and, frankly, seemed skeptical. They had seen many engineering promises fail under real combat conditions, but they followed orders and prepared their vehicles. The first tank began to roll. The sound of its tracks on the gravel was surprisingly loud in the tense silence that had fallen over everyone present. Every man who had worked on that road watched, breathless, as 60 tons of steel tested days of brutal labor. The tank advanced 100 meters, then 200, then 500. Here and there, the surface gave slightly under the immense weight, but it held. The tank continued, traversing every troublesome section. Whitmore and his crew knew intimately every place they had struggled, every point where they had doubted they would succeed. When the first tank emerged from the other side of the swamp, a roar of celebration erupted. Men hugged each other, some openly weeping with relief and exhaustion. But Whitmore held up his hand for silence. One tank passing was good. 3 tanks passing, one after the other, testing the road under repeated use, would be the true test. The second tank began its journey, quickly followed by the third. Both completed the crossing without serious incident. There were a few tense moments where it seemed one track might sink too far, but the road always held, distributing the weight as designed. When the 3 tanks were on the other side, Whitmore finally allowed his own emotions to show. He didn't cry, didn't scream, but stood there, covered in mud from head to toe, staring at what he and his men had created. 5 miles of functional road through an impossible swamp, built in 95 hours. They had completed it with an hour to spare. Colonel Harrison returned that afternoon for the final official inspection. He walked slowly along the road, examining its construction, testing its firmness with his own feet. At the end of his inspection, he stopped before Whitmore and his team of exhausted engineers. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have witnessed many feats of engineering in my career. I have built bridges over impossible rivers, tunnels through impassable mountains, fortifications against overwhelming forces. But what you have done here in these 4 days is beyond anything I have ever seen. You have not just built a road. You have redefined what is possible when men of courage and skill refuse to accept failure." In the following days, the road would be used exactly as planned. Entire tank divisions crossed that swamp, moving quickly to strategic positions that would otherwise have been inaccessible. As for the road itself, it remained functional for months after its initial construction, eventually being expanded and improved until it became a permanent supply route. But this subsequent construction never captured the sheer intensity, the desperate urgency, or the improbable victory of those original 96 hours. Whitmore and many of his engineers would receive commendations for their actions during those 4 days. But when asked about it years later, most of the men said the same thing. The medals were nice, the recognition was appreciated, but what really mattered was knowing they had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had faced an insurmountable obstacle and found a way, not because it was easy, not because they were perfectly prepared, but because it was necessary, and because they refused to give up. The story of the Swamp Road spread, becoming legend in military engineering circles. It was taught in academies as an example of planning under pressure, flawless execution, and inspiring leadership. But it was also something more. It was a reminder that human limits are often illusory, that the impossible is often only what we haven't yet attempted, and that when human beings unite with common purpose and an absolute refusal to fail, there is no swamp too deep, no deadline too short, no challenge too great. The men who built that road returned to their lives. Some remained in the military, applying the lessons learned to countless other projects. Others returned to civilian life, becoming civil engineers, teachers, and builders. But all carried with them the memory of those 4 days when they accomplished the impossible. And in difficult moments in their lives, when they faced seemingly insurmountable problems, many remembered the swamp. If we could turn 8 kilometers of mud into a tank road in 4 days, they thought, then surely I can overcome this. Captain Whitmore would eventually retire as a general, having built an illustrious career based not only on that operation, but on decades of exemplary service. But even in his final days, when veterans approached him to share stories, it was always about the swamp that he loved to talk most. Not about the engineering, though that was impressive. Not about the logistics, though that was complex, but about the men. About how ordinary individuals, when united by purpose and leadership, become capable of extraordinary feats. There's a plaque today marking the approximate location of that original road. Most of it has long since been absorbed back into the swamp or replaced by more modern construction. But the plaque remains, with a simple inscription that tells the story of what happened there. 96 hours that proved that human ingenuity, hard work, and a refusal to accept failure can overcome any natural obstacle. And perhaps that is the true lesson of this extraordinary story. That in a world where we are constantly confronted with problems that seem impossible to solve, where challenges arise that seem too great to overcome, there is power in simply refusing to accept impossibility. There is strength in bringing together the right people, planning meticulously, working tirelessly, and maintaining absolute focus on the goal. The engineers who built that road didn't have superpowers. They didn't possess magical technology. They were simply determined men and women who looked into a swamp and saw not an impossible obstacle, but a problem waiting to be solved. So, the next time you face something that seems impossible, remember the swamp road. Remember that 5 miles of mud were transformed into a functional road in 4 days because someone decided it could be done and gathered people willing to make it happen. Your impossible challenge may not involve tanks and swamps, but the principles remain the same. Plan carefully, execute ruthlessly, never give up. And you might be surprised at what you can achieve, but the story doesn't end simply with the road's completion. What happened in the following weeks and months revealed even more about the true nature of this exceptional feat and the men who made it happen. Because building something impossible is one thing, but seeing how it impacts the world around it is quite another. In the first days after its completion, the Swamp Road became a critical route for military operations in the region. Entire convoys of vehicles passed through it daily, transporting supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, and reinforcements to the front lines. Every tank that rolled over its surface, every truck that crossed without sinking, was a validation of the work of those exhausted men who had refused to accept the impossible. Commanders in the field quickly realized the strategic advantage the road provided. Movements that would previously have taken days bypassing the swamp were now completed in hours by crossing it directly. But the most profound impact was on the very engineers who had built the road. Whitmore noticed a change in his men in the following weeks. They carried themselves differently, spoke with more confidence, and approached new challenges with an attitude that clearly said, "We've done the impossible before. We can do it again." This mentality was contagious, spreading throughout the engineering corps. Projects that would have previously been approached with hesitation were now attacked with vigor. Deadlines that would have seemed absurd were treated as mere challenges to be overcome. Sergeant McCoy, the giant Texan who had questioned how to build a road through soup, became something of a living legend. He used his experience in the swamp as a teaching tool, mentoring young engineers and sharing not only the techniques they had used, but the mindset that had made it all possible. Years later, he would say in interviews that those 4 days in the swamp were the most important of his military career, not because of the engineering techniques he learned, but because of the fundamental lesson that limitations are often more mental than physical. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had led the quarry operation, applied the extreme logistics lessons learned during that mission to countless subsequent projects. He developed a resource management system that would become standard in military engineering operations, based entirely on the principles he had improvised during those frantic days, coordinating the endless flow of stone. His greatest contribution was recognizing that in operations under extreme pressure, the key was not to have the perfect plan, but to have an adaptable plan and teams empowered to make quick decisions when circumstances changed. Young Corporal Jensen, whose vertical piling concept had saved the operation in the deepest sections of the swamp, received a swift promotion and was sent to study advanced engineering. He would eventually become a leading innovator in unstable ground construction, developing techniques that would be used in civil projects around the world. But he always credited that moment in the swamp, when his idea born of desperation was accepted and implemented by leaders willing to listen, as the turning point that shaped his entire career. And as for the swamp itself, it gradually revealed its secrets. Over the following months, engineers returned to study the road in detail, documenting how each section had performed under heavy use, where additional reinforcement was needed, which techniques had worked better than expected, and which had been only marginally adequate. This post-construction study became an invaluable training document, used in military academies for decades to teach both construction techniques and lessons in execution under pressure. One of the most interesting discoveries was that the road had actually strengthened over time. The constant weight of vehicles passing over it had compacted the lower layers of material far beyond what the initial manual compaction had achieved. The stones had fitted together more tightly, the logs had settled deeper, and the entire structure had solidified into something even more robust than originally built. It was as if the road had a life of its own, improving through use. This observation led to changes in how similar projects would be approached in the future, with engineers deliberately designing structures to improve through use rather than simply resist it. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the swamp road was not technical, but human. The story spread far beyond military circles. It was told in engineering schools as an example of excellence under pressure. It was shared in leadership seminars as a demonstration of how to inspire teams to overcome perceived limitations. It was used in corporate training programs to illustrate the power of clear goals and focused execution. And in each retelling, the core message remained the same. When human beings decide to do something, when they commit fully to a goal, and when they work together with unified purpose, they can achieve things that individually would seem impossible. The letters the engineers received from home after news of their exploit spread revealed another important aspect of the story. Families wrote not only with pride that their loved ones had completed a difficult mission, but with a renewed understanding that military service was not just about combat. The contributions of engineers, often unseen and unsung, were absolutely critical to the success of military operations. One father wrote to his engineer son saying he finally understood why he had chosen that specialty, recognizing that saving lives through clever engineering was as heroic as any act of courage on the battlefield. Years later, when veterans of that operation gathered together, they invariably gravitated towards specific stories from those 4 days. The truck driver who had completed 37 round trips between the quarry and the swamp without sleep. The kitchen crew who had kept hot food arriving at the work site 24 hours a day, understanding that men doing extreme physical labor needed constant nourishment. The mechanic who had kept an entire fleet of vehicles operational through frantic preventative maintenance and miraculous repairs. Every person had played a role, every contribution had been essential, and this understanding of interdependence left a lasting mark on everyone involved. The road also became a symbol of something larger in the collective consciousness of the region's military units. When new challenges arose, when missions seemed impossible, someone would inevitably say, "Remember the swamp road?" And suddenly the impossible seemed merely difficult. This shift in mindset, this shift from "I can't" to "how can I?" was perhaps the most valuable contribution the project made. Not just a physical road, but a mental one that led from doubt to possibility. Colonel Harrison, who had inspected the completed road, would later write about that day in his memoirs. He described how walking that road, knowing how it had been built and under what circumstances, had changed his own understanding of leadership. He realized that his role as a senior officer was not to always have all the answers, but to create conditions where talented people could find them. Whitmore had not waited for approval for every decision during those 4 days. He had been empowered to do whatever was necessary, and he had empowered his subordinates in the same way. This culture of trust and distributed autonomy had been critical to success. There were critics too, of course. Some engineers from other units argued that the project had been dangerously risky, that the road could have failed catastrophically, that more conventional, slower methods would have been more prudent. Whitmore responded to these criticisms with characteristic humility, acknowledging that, yes, it had been risky, and yes, it could have failed. But he also pointed out that the risk of not trying, the cost of not having that route available, would have been far greater. Sometimes, he said, the choice is not between a safe and a risky option, but between a risky and a disastrous one. In that context, taking the risk of building the road had actually been the most prudent choice available. As the years passed, the original road was eventually replaced by a more permanent construction. Civil engineers arrived with modern equipment and advanced techniques, building over and around the original structure. But before dismantling it, they documented it extensively, taking soil samples for analysis, measuring how the materials had behaved over time, essentially performing an autopsy on a still living structure. The resulting report, with hundreds of pages of technical data, concluded that the original road had been a triumph of improvised engineering. While it did not meet modern standards for permanent construction, it had exceeded its original design specifications, lasting far longer under much heavier loads than anyone would have anticipated. One of the most emotional moments in the road's history came years later, at a veterans' reunion. A young man approached Whitmore, now aged but still with that piercing gaze. The young man explained that his father had been one of the tankers whose vehicle had crossed that road on the day of the test. His father had survived the war and returned home, where the young man was born years later. But his father always talked about that road, about the engineers who had built it, about how crossing that swamp when everyone expected to have to turn around on a much more dangerous route had possibly saved his life and the lives of many others. The young man simply wanted to say thank you on behalf of his father, who had recently passed away. Whitmore, a man who rarely showed emotion, had tears in his eyes as he embraced the young man, understanding in a new and profound way the true meaning of the work he and his men had done. This is perhaps the most profound truth about accomplishments like the Swamp Road. In the moment, during those 4 frantic days of impossible work, the engineers were focused solely on completing the mission, on getting the job done, on not failing. They had no time to contemplate the larger meaning of their actions or to consider how their actions would reverberate through the years. But over time, the true weight of what they did revealed itself. They didn't just build a road. They created possibilities. They saved lives. They changed outcomes. And they inspired countless others to believe they too could do the impossible. There's a spiritual lesson here too, one that transcends engineering and military strategy. When we face quagmires in our own lives, when we encounter obstacles that seem insurmountable, when we're faced with impossible deadlines and overwhelming expectations, we have a choice. We can look at the quagmire and see only mud, only impossibility, only reasons why something can't be done. Or we can look at that same mud and see building material, see challenge instead of defeat, see opportunity to prove what we're truly capable of when we refuse to accept limitations. The men and women who built that road were no different from any of us. They felt fear, experienced doubt, faced physical and mental exhaustion that tested every fiber of their being, but they chose to continue anyway. They chose to believe that the impossible was only that which had not yet been attempted with sufficient determination. And through that choice, through that refusal to give up, they transformed not just a swamp, but themselves. It's easy to look at stories like this and think they're exceptions, unique moments in history when extraordinary circumstances created extraordinary results. But the truth is, opportunities to do the impossible constantly surround us. They just rarely come with clear titles or obvious recognition. Your swamp might be a broken relationship that needs rebuilding. It might be a failing business that needs saving. It might be a challenging health condition that needs overcoming. It might be a dream everyone says is unrealistic, Whatever it is, the principles remain the same. First, acknowledge the reality of the challenge. Whitmore didn't pretend the swamp was less daunting than it actually was. He looked directly at it, honestly assessed its depth and complexity, and then asked not if it was possible, but how. Second, assemble the right resources. No significant accomplishment is achieved alone. You need people with complementary skills, people willing to work hard, people committed to the shared goal. Third, plan meticulously but execute flexibly. Have a strategy, but be willing to adapt it when reality doesn't match your expectations. Fourth, maintain momentum. Progress creates progress. Movement creates energy. Even when you're exhausted, find ways to keep moving forward. And finally, never ever give up while there's even the slightest possibility of success. The Swamp Road teaches us that limits are often mental constructs rather than physical realities. It teaches us that focused hard work trumps unfocused talent. It teaches us that committed teams achieve more than brilliant individuals. It teaches us that leadership is not about having all the answers, but about creating the conditions where answers can be found. And it teaches us that the impossible is often just what we haven't yet tried with sufficient determination. So when you find yourself facing your own swamp, remember this story. Remember the men covered in mud working beyond exhaustion, refusing to accept failure. Remember that they had no superpowers or magical technology. They had only determination, hard work, and an absolute refusal to give up. And if they could transform 5 miles of impossible mud into a functional road in 96 hours, then you can certainly face whatever lies before you now. The legacy of the Swamp Road isn't just about military engineering. It's about the human spirit. It's about what we become capable of when we decide something must be done and fully commit to making it happen. It's about transforming the impossible into the inevitable through persistent work and a refusal to accept defeat. And it's about how our actions, even when they seem small or insignificant in the moment, can reverberate through the years, touching lives we'll never know, inspiring people we'll never meet. May this story inspire you to look at your own impossible challenges with new eyes. May it remind you that you are capable of much more than you probably believe. May it encourage you to gather your team, make your plan, and begin the work of turning your swamp into a road. And above all, may it remind you that the impossible is only what we haven't done yet. With determination, hard work, and faith in what is possible, when we refuse to give up, there is no swamp too deep, no deadline too short, no challenge too great. Because if military engineers can build a tank road through 5 miles of swamp in 4 days, then surely with the grace of the Lord God, you can face whatever lies before you now.